The afternoon sun bathed Centennial Park in a golden glow, its warmth gentle yet alive, casting long shadows that danced across the landscape. The trees swayed softly, their branches whispering secrets to anyone willing to pause and listen. Families sprawled on picnic blankets, laughter bubbling up like music. Runners moved along the pathways, their rhythmic footfalls blending with the faint jingle of an ice cream cart bell, adding a cheerful undertone to the park's serene ambience. On a bench near the playground sat Michelle Carter, her water bottle cool against her lips as she watched her 8-year-old niece, Tiana, conquer the monkey bars. Determination radiated from the child's face, her small teeth biting into her lip, her focus unshakable, each rung a personal triumph. "Look, Aunt Michelle! I'm almost there!" Tiana shouted, her voice ringing out like a victory cry. Michelle lowered her sunglasses, her smile soft but proud. "I see you, champ! Just one more, pull hard," she encouraged, her tone brimming with admiration. With a tiny grunt, Tiana hoisted herself onto the final bar, gripping it tightly before swinging down gracefully. She landed on the ground, arms outstretched like a gymnast sticking the landing. "Perfect 10!" Michelle called, clapping her hands together. Tiana beamed, racing back to her aunt for a high five. This was their ritual, every weekend sacred, a brief escape from the relentless demands of Michelle's life. To everyone else in the park, Michelle appeared ordinary, just another woman dressed casually in jeans and a loose white blouse, savoring time with her niece. But beneath the surface lay secrets that would astonish anyone who dared to look closer. She wasn't merely Tiana's loving aunt, she was a CIA operative, trained to navigate some of the world's most perilous situations. Yet here, in this moment, those burdens felt distant, replaced by the simple joy of connection. "You thirsty, Tiana?" Michelle asked, pulling a juice box from her bag. Tiana grabbed it eagerly, plopping down beside her aunt. "I think I'm the best at the monkey bars now," she declared confidently. Michelle chuckled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You just might be. But remember, it's not about being the best, it's about doing your best. That's what matters." Tiana nodded thoughtfully, sipping her juice, her gaze drifting toward a commotion near the fountain. Two men stood facing each other, their voices rising sharply, cutting through the park's peaceful hum. Michelle noticed immediately, tilting her head slightly, her instincts flaring. Their argument grew animated, gestures wild, yet most visitors continued their activities, unwilling to get involved. Still, Michelle's sharp eyes lingered. "What was wrong with them?" Tiana asked, her small brows knitting together in concern. "It's just an argument, sweetie," Michelle reassured her, placing a calming hand on her niece's shoulder. "Sometimes people get upset and don't know how to talk it out." But deep down, Michelle knew better. Years of experience told her there was more to it. She scanned the scene quickly, noting the tension in their stances, the way one man gestured wildly while the other stood stiffly, his jaw clenched tight. She didn't want Tiana to worry, so she kept her tone light. "Why don't you go back to the monkey bars? I'll keep an eye on things here." Tiana hesitated but nodded, skipping off toward the playground. Michelle remained seated, her posture relaxed but her mind alert. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him, a police officer striding purposefully toward the fountain, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. His uniform was crisp, his stride commanding, but something about the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, suggested this wasn't a routine patrol. Michelle's training kicked in, sharpening her senses. She studied him carefully, observing the quick glances he cast around the park, the subtle tension in his movements. He wasn't merely assessing the situation, he was already forming judgments. The officer reached the fountain, his voice slicing through the air as he barked something at the two men. Michelle couldn't hear the words, but she saw their reactions, hands raised defensively, voices softening as they tried to explain themselves. Her eyes narrowed. She had seen this play out too many times before, a delicate moment that could either diffuse or ignite the situation. She stayed seated, fingers resting lightly on the bench, her posture unchanged. But inside, every fiber of her being was tuned to what was unfolding. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a witness. And then, the officer's gaze shifted. It swept past the arguing men, scanning the crowd until it landed on her. Michelle didn't look away. She met his eyes with calm confidence, her expression unreadable. In that instant, she knew the focus had shifted. What had started as a quiet afternoon was about to take a dramatic turn. The officer's grip tightened around Michelle's wrist, his frustration evident in the rigid set of his jaw. But Michelle wasn't an ordinary bystander, far from it. Years of training coursed through her veins, sharpening her instincts, steadying her resolve. As he attempted to twist her arm behind her back, she moved with precision, subtly shifting her body to disrupt his leverage. The crowd gasped audibly, their collective breath catching in their throats. "Did you see that?" someone whispered, awe creeping into their voice. "She knows what she's doing." The officer stumbled backward, caught off guard by her speed and control. His hand instinctively hovered near his holster, but Michelle raised hers slowly, deliberately, ensuring her movements remained non-threatening. "I'm not here to fight you," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "But I will not be unlawfully detained." Her words hung in the air, heavy with authority, as the officer's hand inched closer to his weapon. "You don't dictate what happens here," he growled, his tone laced with defiance. "You're under arrest." Michelle's heart raced, though her exterior betrayed no hint of fear. She had faced far worse than this man's misplaced bravado. "Then call your supervisor," she replied evenly, her voice unwavering. "I'm requesting one now, it's my right." Her declaration reverberated through the chaos, grounding the moment. For a split second, the officer hesitated, his confidence wavering as more voices joined the chorus. "Yeah, call your supervisor," a woman shouted, emboldened by Michelle's composure. The officer muttered something into his radio, his focus never leaving Michelle. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered, his contempt dripping like venom. Michelle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the weight of the crowd's eyes settle on her, their murmurs swelling into a low hum. The tension in the air was suffocating, yet Michelle stood unshaken. She had stared down danger in its many forms, this was merely another test. "I think it's time for you to stop making assumptions," she finally said, her voice low but firm, each word landing like a hammer strike. The officer took a step forward, puffing out his chest in a futile attempt at dominance. But before he could speak, the faint wail of approaching sirens sliced through the din. Backup was on its way. The crowd grew restless, their voices rising in volume and urgency. "This is ridiculous," someone yelled. "She didn't do anything." Michelle glanced toward Tiana, who still stood frozen near the bench, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. With a slight nod, Michelle offered her niece a silent reassurance, "Everything will be okay." Yet, she knew the next few moments would determine whether that promise held true. The officer's grip on authority was slipping, and Michelle tread carefully, acutely aware that one wrong move could endanger those watching, especially Tiana. As the sirens grew louder, Michelle made her decision. Reaching into her back pocket with slow, deliberate movements, she pulled out her credentials. Holding up the small leather wallet, she flipped it open to reveal the gold badge gleaming in the sunlight. "You want to know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. The officer's eyes widened as he read the words etched onto the badge, Central Intelligence Agency. The crowd fell silent, the revelation sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. Someone whispered, almost reverently, "She's CIA." Michelle broke the silence, her voice calm but resolute. "Officer, I suggest you stand down and call your supervisor immediately." The younger officer froze, his face a storm of disbelief and barely contained anger. Fumbling with his radio, he stammered a request for a supervisor, labeling the situation high priority. The crowd erupted into murmurs once again, their phones capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Michelle lowered her badge but kept it visible, her expression unreadable. Though the tension teetered on the edge of breaking, she knew this was only the beginning. The fallout from this moment would ripple far beyond Centennial Park. the flashing lights of a police cruiser bathed the scene in rhythmic pulses as it pulled up near the fountain. Out stepped a senior officer, his uniform slightly worn but his presence radiating authority. His arrival alone seemed to quiet the murmurs, though the palpable tension lingered like a shadow. Michelle stood motionless, her badge still extended, as the younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under scrutiny. The senior officer approached quickly, his sharp gaze sweeping the scene before landing on Michelle. His eyes dropped to the badge in her hand, and recognition flickered across his face. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "I'm Captain Reynolds. Can you explain what's going on here?" Michelle didn't lower her badge. Her tone was professional, her words measured. "Your officer attempted to detain me without cause. I identified myself as a CIA agent and requested a supervisor to address this misconduct." Captain Reynolds turned to the younger officer, who opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. "She was interfering," the officer muttered defensively. "Acting suspicious." Michelle cut him off, her voice slicing through his weak justification. "I was sitting on that bench with my niece, who is now terrified because of your baseless assumptions. My only interference was offering to clarify that the argument between those two men," she pointed toward the jogger and the man with the briefcase, now standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, "was a verbal disagreement, not a physical altercation. Your officer's actions escalated an already resolved situation." Captain Reynolds frowned, clearly unsettled by the gravity of the moment. Turning to the younger officer, he asked, "Is this true?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. "She wouldn't cooperate," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "And she moved in a way that seemed like she was resisting." Michelle interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "I moved in a way to protect myself from unnecessary aggression. Everything I did was measured, non-threatening, and well within my rights. Your officer, on the other hand, overstepped his authority." The crowd, emboldened by Michelle's composure, began to speak up. "She's right," a middle-aged man called out. "We saw it all. She didn't do anything wrong." Another voice chimed in, sharper this time. "Why'd he target her in the first place?" Captain Reynolds raised a hand to quiet the growing outcry. Exhaling sharply, he turned back to Michelle. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, and I assure you we'll handle this appropriately. If you'd like to file a formal complaint." Michelle's voice carried over his, cutting him off mid-sentence. "This isn't about a complaint, Captain. This is about accountability. What happened here isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern, one that endangers innocent people every day. The only difference today is that I have the resources and the training to stand up for myself. Many others don't." Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with both the crowd and, judging by his expression, Captain Reynolds himself. He nodded slowly, then addressed the younger officer. "Stand down," he said firmly. "And hand over your notes and body cam footage. I'll take it from here." The younger officer reluctantly obeyed, muttering something under his breath as he stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment. Captain Reynolds turned back to Michelle. "I'll need to verify your credentials, of course. It's protocol." Michelle handed him her badge without hesitation. "Do what you need to do." The crowd remained transfixed, their phones capturing every second. Some whispered among themselves, while others openly voiced their support for Michelle. A teenage girl near the front turned to her mother. "Why does this always happen to people like her?" The mother, clearly uncomfortable, replied, "Because some people see what they want to see, not what's really there." Moments later, Captain Reynolds returned, holding Michelle's badge with a newfound respect. "Your credentials check out," he said. "I want to personally apologize for how you were treated today." Michelle took her badge back and nodded, though her expression remained serious. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. Your department needs to address the systemic issues that allow situations like this to happen in the first place." Reynolds hesitated, then nodded again. "You're right. And I'll make sure this incident is thoroughly reviewed." Michelle turned to the crowd, her voice rising so everyone could hear. This isn't just about me. What happened today is a reflection of something much bigger. We have to hold people accountable, officers, leaders, everyone, if we want things to change. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices filled with a mixture of relief and anger at the injustice they had witnessed. Tiana ran to Michelle, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist. Michelle knelt down, pulling her niece into a protective embrace. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "It's over now." Tiana looked up at her aunt, her small face a mixture of fear and admiration. "You were so brave," she said softly. Michelle smiled, though the weight of the day lingered in her eyes. Sometimes being brave is the only choice we have. As Michelle stood back up, looking out at the crowd and the humbled officer, she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone watching, and what they would take away from it. The confrontation at Centennial Park became more than a fleeting incident, it became a movement. By the time Michelle returned home that evening, her phone was flooded with notifications. Videos of the incident had gone viral, sparking conversations across platforms. Hashtags like #StandWithMichelle and #AccountabilityForAll trended within hours, igniting a national dialogue. That evening, as Michelle sat in her modest living room with Tiana fast asleep in her arms, she scrolled through the news on her tablet. Every major outlet covered the story. One headline read, "CIA agent exposes police misconduct, a nation reacts." Another posed a question, if she weren't CIA, would this have ended differently? Michelle sighed, her fingers lingering over the screen. She knew the answer, and so did millions of others. Alight with determination. "We can make it like that, right, Aunt Michelle?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope and curiosity. Michelle paused, her mind racing with the weight of the question. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that the world was far from perfect, yet still worth fighting for? She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Tiana's face. "Yes, baby," she said softly, her voice unwavering despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But it'll take a lot of people working together, people like you and me, to make it happen." Tiana nodded solemnly, as if she fully understood the gravity of the task ahead. She returned to her drawing, adding a sunburst in the corner of the page, its rays stretching across the scene like a promise of brighter days. Michelle watched her, marveling at the resilience of innocence. Despite everything Tiana had witnessed, the shouting, the fear, the tension, she still believed in the possibility of a better world. And in that moment, Michelle realized that her niece wasn't just a witness to change, she was a part of it. The next morning, Michelle stood on the balcony of her modest apartment, sipping coffee as the city stirred to life below her. The streets were alive with movement, cars honking, pedestrians rushing, the hum of activity blending into a symphony of urban existence. But amidst the chaos, Michelle felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent years navigating the shadows, operating in silence, her identity shielded by layers of secrecy. Now, her face was everywhere, on news outlets, social media feeds, even protest signs. It was surreal, overwhelming, and yet, liberating. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her, pulling her from her thoughts. Another notification, another message of support or criticism. She didn't need to check it to know. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of attention, both positive and negative. Some praised her courage, calling her a beacon of hope in a fractured system. Others accused her of grandstanding, of using her position to gain notoriety. Michelle scrolled through the notifications briefly, her expression unreadable. Then she set the phone down, turning her gaze back to the horizon. "What happens when a shadow steps into the light?" she murmured to herself, the question hanging in the air like smoke. She didn't have an answer, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain, stepping back into the shadows wasn't an option. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Later that day, Michelle found herself seated in a conference room, surrounded by policymakers, activists, and community leaders. The air was thick with urgency, each person bringing their own perspective to the table. Michelle listened intently, her sharp eyes scanning the room as voices rose and fell in passionate debate. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding without being overbearing. "This isn't about blame," she began, her voice steady but laced with conviction. "It's about responsibility. Every system is made up of individuals, and every individual has the power to challenge bias, to demand accountability, to push for change. If we wait for someone else to do it, if we keep pointing fingers instead of extending hands, we'll never move forward." Her words resonated deeply, sparking nods of agreement around the table. One activist, a woman with decades of experience in civil rights advocacy, leaned back in her chair, studying Michelle with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "You've become a symbol," she said finally, her tone thoughtful. "How does that feel?" Michelle hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "Heavy," she admitted. "But necessary." The meeting concluded with tentative plans for collaboration, a framework for addressing systemic issues within law enforcement and beyond. As Michelle gathered her things, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, almost imperceptible spark, but hope nonetheless. Change was slow, often frustratingly so, but it was happening. And she was determined to be a part of it. That evening, as she tucked Tiana into bed, Michelle lingered by her niece's bedside, watching the rise and fall of the child's chest as she drifted off to sleep. On the nightstand beside her lay the drawing Tiana had created, the park, the smiling faces, the badge-wearing figure holding hands with a little girl. Michelle picked it up, studying it in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. It was simple, innocent, and achingly hopeful. "Good night, my brave girl," Michelle whispered, placing the drawing back where it belonged. She turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in darkness. But as she closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the image of Tiana's drawing from her mind. It stayed with her, a quiet reminder of why she had stepped into the light, and why she couldn't step back. The days that followed brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new conversations. Michelle continued to navigate the complexities of her dual identity, as a CIA operative and as a public advocate for justice. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of expectations threatened to overwhelm her. But she pressed on, driven by the belief that even the smallest actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully understand. And so, as the weeks turned into months, Michelle Carter became more than a name or a headline. She became a catalyst, a force for change in a world desperate for it. Her story wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who dared to hope, to stand up, to speak out. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Michelle walked it with purpose, one step at a time. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation, a sea of faces illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights. Michelle stood behind the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. She scanned the audience, students clutching notebooks, activists wearing pins that declared their causes, parents holding hands with children, teachers gripping coffee cups for comfort, and even a few uniformed officers who had come to listen, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with expectation, as if everyone in the packed community center knew they were about to witness something significant. Taking a deep breath, Michelle began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade slicing tension. "What happened to me at Centennial Park wasn't unique," she said, pausing to let the words settle. "It wasn't extraordinary. In fact, it was all too common." Her gaze swept across the room, meeting eyes filled with curiosity, anger, hope, and doubt. "The difference is," she continued, her tone unwavering, "I had a badge in training that gave me the confidence to stand up for myself. But what about the countless others who don't? What happens to them?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but no one spoke aloud. Michelle's words weren't just statements, they were challenges, invitations to think deeper, feel harder, act bolder. She pressed on, her voice steady and resolute. "This isn't about vilifying individuals," she emphasized, leaning slightly forward. "It's about changing a system that allows bias to operate unchecked. It's about creating a culture where accountability becomes the norm, not the exception." Her words landed like stones skipping across still water, each one sending ripples outward. The room remained silent, save for the faint rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, absorbing the weight of her message. Michelle paused, letting the moment breathe, before offering a small, hopeful smile. "But this isn't just about what's broken," she added softly, her voice carrying a note of optimism. "It's also about what we can build together. We can create a world where no child has to fear the very people sworn to protect them. A world where dignity and justice aren't privileges, they're rights." As if released from a spell, the crowd erupted into applause. Some rose to their feet, clapping fervently, while others wiped tears from their eyes. Michelle stepped back from the podium, her heart heavy with the enormity of the task ahead but buoyed by the energy in the room. She knew this was only one step, a single stride on a much longer journey, but it felt like the right step. And sometimes, that was enough. In the days that followed, Michelle's inbox overflowed with messages. Letters arrived in her mailbox, handwritten notes scrawled with gratitude and courage. Calls came from strangers eager to share their stories, seeking advice or simply wanting to thank her for speaking out. Among these voices, one message stood out, a letter from a retired teacher in Nebraska. "You may not have asked to be a symbol," the woman wrote, "but you've become one. Thank you for reminding us that change is possible, even when it feels out of reach." Michelle read the letter twice, her chest tightening with emotion. She saved it carefully, tucking it away like a treasure. It reminded her that the fight for change wasn't hers alone, it belonged to anyone willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better. Later that evening, as Michelle tucked Tiana into bed, the little girl looked up at her aunt with wide, earnest eyes. "Aunt Michelle," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "are you going to make the world better?" Michelle knelt beside her niece, brushing a strand of hair from Tiana's forehead. She met the child's gaze, seeing within it both innocence and determination. "I'm going to try," she replied softly, her voice laced with resolve. "And so will you. Together, we'll make it better." As Tiana drifted off to sleep, her breathing slow and steady, Michelle sat quietly by her side, reflecting on the journey ahead. She knew the road would be long, fraught with challenges and setbacks. Yet, she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Each person inspired by her story, each voice raised in solidarity, carried her forward. As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, Michelle carried with her a renewed sense of purpose. The world she envisioned, a world of justice, fairness, and hope, wasn't just a dream. It was a goal, one worth fighting for every single day. Michelle's story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, we hold immense power. We can stand tall. We can demand change. If her journey inspires you, consider how you might make a difference. Whether it's by speaking up, supporting someone in need, or challenging unfairness when you see it, your actions matter. Change begins with individuals, and individuals shape the world. Together, we can build a brighter future, one step at a time.